Ladies and gentlemen, the Supreme Court, did not look at whether or not to overturn the guilty verdict. Again, and hit subscribe to this channel right now. Everything that I have been saying is taking place. I told you the past couple of days, if you watch the channel and you watch all the way through, I explain, even if they sentence Trump, let's say they sentence Trump and they're going to tomorrow, that's only going to expedite the guilty verdict being overturned. The Supreme Court, and hit subscribe to this channel right now, it's very important, gave Trump a huge monumental immunity victory. They gave Trump a huge victory over the state Supreme Court in Colorado, overturning the Colorado ban. They gave Trump a huge victory on January defendants, where sentencing was overzealous and unconstitutional. Okay? And they're going to give Trump a huge, monumental victory when they actually look at the case to see if a state, for example, can level a federal statute unilaterally without the FEC and the DOJ involved. That is unconstitutional. According to our system of federalism, a state cannot level a federal crime. But they didn't look at that. Okay, it wasn't even an FEC crime to begin with. They didn't look at that yet. So hit subscribe. This is not a big deal. This is a vapid, Pyrrhic victory because this only expedites for Democrats and media and anyone who dislikes Trump, because it only expedites the Supreme Court looking at it. So you have BBC, Supreme Court rejects Trump bid to halt sentencing. The Guardian, U.S. Supreme Court rejects Trump bid to call off sentencing. I have explained they're probably going to allow the sentencing. They're not going to want to interfere, even though they know it's an unconstitutional guilty verdict. The FEC dropped the case. How on earth could he be guilty of an FEC violation? The Department of Justice dropped the case. The Supreme Court tosses out convictions all the time. This was last year. Court throws out conviction of former Cuomo aide. The difference being now you have, though, a state unilaterally defining what a federal statute entails, which is not allowed here. Just listen to this once again. When they get the case after he's been sentenced, which is what I've been saying, the guilty verdict will be overturned. The guilty verdict can't be overturned before actual sentencing, and it's purely partisan, which is why they lost the popular vote. If you're happy because Trump, if you're a liberal, wonderful, highly educated, morally superior liberal Democrat, and you're so happy and giddy and jumping for joy, well, Trump won the immunity victory. He won the case against the Colorado State Supreme Court. He won the sentencing challenge for January defendants. He's going to win this case once it reaches completion, which is there has to be some sentencing, and I explained that the past couple of days. Then the Supreme Court can look at it. Okay, and Jonathan Turley makes reference to that right here.
No, Justice Barrett has been playing more and more of a central role or centrist role on the court. She's often voting with the left of the court. She's sort of carving out her own voice, her own place. And I don't want to condemn her for it. I can disagree with her decisions. She's a very thoughtful jurist. And what she did here is consistent with what a lot of appellate judges do. They really prefer overwhelmingly to have these key cases completed, to have the sentence in so they can review the whole case. They hate interlocutory appeals. They hate these things coming up in partial form. And so she's consistent in that regard.
The Supreme Court did not say that the guilty verdict is constitutional. The Supreme Court didn't even look at whether the guilty verdict was constitutional or not. There are numerous constitutional grounds, right to a speedy trial. There was very bizarre. They were not even given a specific legal statute. We still don't know what the actual crime was on a federal, they don't know the federal statute. If you're a wonderful, highly educated, morally superior liberal Democrat, what was the statute, the specific statute, not an array of federal laws that Democrats in New York said that he broke, the specific statute that he broke, or statutes? Because simply making reference to 20, 30, 40, 50 laws that's not enough. Furthermore, the FEC and the DOJ must be involved. You'll hear that here. Hit subscribe to this channel. This has nothing to do with a victory. If anything, there's a victory for Trump. The Supreme Court sees it sooner rather than later.
Mark, I appreciate what you said in your opening statement, because the Supreme Court has made clear, not just in one offside comment, in 3 very clear decisions, that only the federal government can enforce federal law. Only the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission can prosecute and bring suit for violations of federal election law. They're the guardians of how federal election should run. And so what happened? And basically decided to prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
The Supreme Court did not get a chance to hear the case. They simply allowed sentencing. This is not a victory for... See, the morally superior among us who lost the popular vote, the presidency, every battleground state, the House, the Senate, and they don't have the Supreme Court. Okay. They lost everything politically, but they don't live, like, if you voted Harris, you think Biden and you voted Harris, you think Biden was a fantastic president and you voted Harris? Okay, you're looking at today saying, oh, this is fantastic, this is amazing. But the Supreme Court throws out convictions all the time. All the time. In fact, there was a unanimous conviction, unanimous overturning years back in 2016 of Bob McDonnell, the former Virginia governor. This is just one example. Okay, last year. But here, they did not look at the actual case. By the way, to my super chat, thank you. If I actually thank a person, and it's a specific person, like, if you give a super chat, I'll thank you. I have a couple comments lately, which is hilarious. We're like, how come you're thanking Paul so much? Like, well, Paul is giving a super chat every day or every other day. Thank God. That's so kind and generous of him. There's no, like, racket or there's no scheming going on. It's called super chat. So if you give a super chat, I will state your name and thank you. Just like here, JPAT09, HA notification, thank you. If you're a member, I'll thank you very much. So I've been getting a one or two really amusing comments on what's going on. Why are you mentioning people's names? Like, well, if you give a super chat, I'm going to thank you. But here, let's just listen to this again, and then we'll go and actually, let's just start from the beginning here.
Former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, UC Berkeley Law Professor, Hoover Institution, visiting fellow, and all-around great guy. John, you see this case in Manhattan. How bad is it for our nation? How bad is it for our electoral system? How bad is it for the rule of law, for federalism, the whole kit and caboodle?
Mark, thanks for having me back. I am saddened at what this case has now done to our political and constitutional system. It's hard to exaggerate the harm that it's going to do, not just to Donald Trump. He's important, but the more important question is, what does this do to our institutions? As you said, our legal system, our electoral system, our system of federalism and the separation of powers for all future presidents, for all future citizens. First, we have never prosecuted a former president before. This was not because past presidents hadn't done anything bad. It's because we thought it was the best thing for our separation of powers to leave presidents alone. And the reason why is because the Constitution concentrates so much responsibility and authority in the president to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, to protect the country from foreign threats, that we don't want our presidents, when they're making the hardest decisions on behalf of the country, to be worrying about whether they're going to be prosecuted or not. We don't want our presidents to be insurance claims adjusters worrying about risks and balances of their own personal finances and their own personal legal situation. We want them to decide what's best for the country.
And this is why when the Supreme Court actually looks at the case, like John Yoo is about to say, they will 100% certain, which I've been saying, overturn the state guilty verdict. The reason that this is so difficult is that generally it's tough to overturn a state conviction, okay? In this case, the state utilized federal law. Not difficult at all. It's never happened before. I don't think there's never been an example of a state utilizing a federal statute without the Department of Justice, in this case the FEC or the federal government, involved. So this is not rocket science. This is definitely not a victory. Definitely not a victory. Very much so a Pyrrhic, vapid, completely public relations oriented victory. He's going to get sentenced. So what? He won the popular vote because everyone knows this is purely partisan. They know that a blue state is going after an incoming Republican president, and they know that if you do any research at all, it is blatantly unconstitutional. It's just as unconstitutional as the Colorado ban, which was unanimously overturned, which I told you would be unanimously overturned.
Now, because this case was so frivolous, because it was based on such concocted legal theories, it opens the door wide now for any DA, and there are 2,500 of them in the country, any DA to sue and prosecute any president, any past president, perhaps any sitting president under the theories that were put forward earlier. I think an even worse problem is for the rule of law. Because what we've all learned now, I think, is that prosecutors can destroy a person. They can destroy a person's reputation, his finances, just by investigating them, even before they get to court, just by publicly announcing that they're investigating someone. We have for 230 years relied on prosecutors, on our elected chief executives, governors, and presidents to show, again, statesmanship, to go show good judgment, not to abuse this power. But now what we've seen is that I think the Biden Justice Department and these blue city DAs are abusing this power not to try to stop crime, but to target individuals because they don't like them, because they're unpopular, and then to find the crimes to fit the man. That is directly a direct assault on the rule of law. And that harms all of us in the country, all the citizens, not just Trump, not just presidents, but you and me and everyone else.
And what about the electoral system when you have one of these DAs deciding that they get to decide or try to decide the outcome of an election through the process? They can make a ambiguous reference to federal law, seize jurisdiction from what is a complex layer of federal authorities and decision makers when it comes to federal election campaign law, let alone seize the authority from federal courts and the Supreme Court to make these decisions, regardless of what the New York courts say up and down the chain. I mean, whatever the New York courts say up and down the chain, that is not the final decision. If the federal Supreme Court decides to step in, that's the final decision for you, New York. So if I'm in California and I see that it worked in New York because we have this lumbering appellate process, but I can interfere with an election, by the time the appellate process catches up with me, so be it. They're going to time it the same way. So this can really become a cancer on the political campaign system of the highest federal official in the United States, and the election there too, no?
Mark, I appreciate what you said in your opening statement, because the Supreme Court has made clear, not just in one offside comment, in 3 very clear decisions, that only the federal government can enforce federal law. Only the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission can prosecute and bring suit for violations of federal election law. They're the guardians of how federal election should run. And so what happened here is that the DA, approved by this judge, Judge Merchan, grabbed the authority away and basically decided to prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
The Supreme Court has not heard the case. They simply were asked to block sentencing, and they're not going to go out of their way. I mean, they're just not. I wish they would. They're not going to go out of their way for President Trump. There is immunity, which we'll get to in a second, but this is what John Yoo. I mean, they're not going to go out of their way to interfere in a state conviction. They will overturn the conviction when it gets to them and there's a question about the conviction's constitutionality. They're not going to prevent and block, and I've been saying this the past week and a half. When I explain, when you look at the titles of these, they will overturn the guilty conviction. Okay? They will not necessarily block or prevent sentencing, but the sentencing increases the likelihood and the odds and expedites the Supreme Court looking at this case. They're not going to simply allow 2,500 DAs across the country to start indicting federal candidates of the opposite political party, utilizing federal law and interpreting the federal law on a state level. It's not going to happen. So this is blatantly unconstitutional. Just like when the Colorado State Supreme Court said, oh yeah, Trump committed a rebellion. It's like, well, no, he didn't, number one. Number two, he wasn't convicted of that. They make absurd leaps of logic. They lost everything politically. And yet they still look at these little vapid public relations victories as like, okay, the average person, or if you watch this channel, I've been pretty much right about everything. Trump winning, every Supreme Court victory, hit subscribe if you're new. Have I not been pretty much right about every single thing? Trump won the popular vote, every battleground state. You can look back, I've been saying he's going to win in a landslide. He essentially won in a landslide. He won the popular vote, every battleground state, the Senate, the House, the presidency, and he has the Supreme Court. When it gets to the Supreme Court, they're going to ask, what was the federal crime? And the state of New York is going to have to defend unilaterally choosing a federal statute without the Department of Justice involved. That is unconstitutional. The DOJ dropped the case. And there is no federal crime. Listen to Bradley Smith here, former Federal Election Commission chairman.
Right. Well, this raises yet another question is can, of course, a state prosecutor prosecute an alleged, quote, federal crime that the Federal Election Commission and the Department of Justice have already decided not to prosecute? We might think about it this way. Imagine if New York just passed a law saying it is a violation of the New York Penal Code to violate any federal law. And then we'll decide what federal law is violated, right? That would subvert the entire federal state structure of law. I mean, that would allow state DAs to start prosecuting anything they think is a violation of federal law, even though the federal courts or federal administrative agencies or the Department of Justice had felt it was not a violation of federal law. So it's really getting into sort of wacky legal theories, but also I think very dangerous theories. Again, if we think about the rule of law, I don't think this can be emphasized enough that if Trump had paid for these with campaign funds, which the DA says he had to have done, I think they'd probably be chasing him today for illegal conversion of campaign funds to pay this personal expense.
Now, you'll hear Samuel Alito in a second, but when Democrats and media say, well, he's been convicted and found guilty of federal crimes, that's because a jurisdiction or a state state prosecutors, a district attorney in a city run by Democrats despised Trump, and an attorney general in a state that is run by Democrats, wanted to go after Trump. This isn't rocket science. The wonderful, highly educated, morally superior Democrats, what they do is they recoil in indignation. How dare you? Well, there was not a hint of bias. Oh, they wanted Alito and Thomas to recuse themselves, but none of these watchdog groups want judges going after Trump to recuse themselves, or DAs or prosecutors who have direct ties to the Democratic Party. But let's continue. This is Samuel Alito taking the Colorado legal team to task.
Justice Alito?
Suppose there's a country that proclaims again and again and again that the United States is its biggest enemy, and suppose that the President of the United States, for diplomatic reasons, think that it's in the best interests of the United States to provide funds or release funds so that they can be used by that country.
By the way, the hypothetical pertained to Trump. Trump came in with a different foreign policy, and Democrats were like, "How come you're so generous?" Or what would they say? You're so soft on this specific adversary. It's like, it's called a change in foreign policy, genius. That's why you change presidents. That's why you change foreign policies. Democrats are all for democracy. Except when the incoming president in 2016, Trump, had a different foreign policy than President Obama. Then it was an abomination and complete blasphemy that, God forbid, he had a different foreign policy. So what? That's what you vote for. Anyway, they impeached him because of that, but they impeached him because of a phone call that didn't even directly address what they accused him of, and the president of that country literally stated Trump did not commit a crime.
Would a state determine that that person has given aid and comfort to the enemy and therefore keep that person off the ballot?
No, Your Honor. This court has never interpreted the aid and comfort language, which also is present in the treason clause. But commentators have suggested it's been rarely applied because treason prosecutions are so rare. But commentators have suggested that, first of all, that aid and comfort really only applies in the context of a declared war, or at least an adversarial relationship where there is, in fact, a war between two countries. And second, the intent standard would do a lot of work there, because under Section 3, whatever the underlying conduct is, engaging in insurrection or aid and comfort has to be done with the intent to further the unlawful purpose of the insurrection or to aid the enemies in their pursuit of war against the United States.
Mind you, the Colorado legal counsel here is very brilliant, intelligent, educated. It was a unanimous Supreme Court ruling that I said would take place. You can look back at the live streams. We were talking about a unanimous reversal right before it happened. And again, you have a lot of highly educated, morally superior liberal Democrats throughout the country. They're very passionate and they're very educated. But sometimes that doesn't equate to wisdom. You can be passionate and educated and enthusiastic and, feel that you're on the side of the right side of history, the morality, and you could feel that you're the most moral person on the planet. But if you lack wisdom and you're only if you're only going after your political rival, you're pretending to be moral, but you're really just going after your political rival, or you're like, for example, when certain people disown friends and family, there's like a meme, "I'm doing it for morality. It wasn't about politics." Like, nah, you're politics. If Trump won the popular vote in every battleground state, the Senate and the House, and you're unable to see all the terrible consequences of your liberal Democratic Party governance, you're unable to see the immoral activity that Democrats have allowed. It could be on the topic of the border. It could be on the topic of foreign policy. It could be lots of things. It could be social topics we won't talk about. If you're unable to see the immorality there, I mean, all you have to do, you can look at 90s musical artists and Hollywood producers and liberal Democratic New York donors that give to the Democratic Party. Look no further Sam Bankman-Fried was a crypto Ponzi scheme. He was the second largest Democratic Party donor. Look no further than the money associated with the Democratic Party to find the immorality. But anyway, let's continue. This is Samuel Alito right before the Colorado ban was overturned unanimously. Again, they did not look at the case. They just are allowing sentencing. And anyway, this only makes Trump stronger. He's the Obi-Wan Kenobi of politics. He won the popular vote because of this type of thing. But they in their mind, they're like, oh, we're not sentencing him to jail. The fact that he's even sentenced at all is like the most overt, blatant example of partisanship.
Now, let me come back to the question of what we would do if different states had adjudicated the question of whether former President Trump is an insurrectionist using a different record, different rulings on the admissibility of evidence, perhaps different standards of proof. Then what would we do?
Ultimately, this court would, first of all, if there were deficiencies in the record, the court could either refuse to hear the case or it could decide on the basis of deficiencies of the record.
Well, would we have to decide what is the appropriate rule of evidence that should be applied in this case? Would we have to decide what is the appropriate standard of proof? Would we give any deference to these findings by state court judges, some of whom may be elected? Would we have to have our own trial?
No, Your Honor. This court takes the evidentiary record as it's given, and here we have an evidentiary record that all the parties agree is sufficient for a decision in this case. And then, as I discussed earlier, there's a possibility of a Bose Corp independent review of the facts, but ultimately.
And by the way, for example, in the live chat, someone wrote a very intriguing comment. Well, a convicted felon cannot get security clearance, or let's just say that he's technically a convicted felon. Okay, which he's not really, if you understand, it's a state going after a political rival, but everything that emanates from this, and that's a great point in the live chat. I appreciate that very much. Thank you. That is a great point. Every single thing emanating from this sentencing tomorrow expedites the Supreme Court looking at this.
What we have here is...
We'll get back to Samuel Alito in a second. Every single thing expedites the Supreme Court looking at this and it being overturned here.
Prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
And they will get a chance to hear this case the more that this becomes a thorn in the president's side, which it won't be a thorn in the president's side for long because it'll be overturned by the Supreme Court. Okay. Not only is, like I said, a state cannot level a federal statute. Otherwise, like John Yoo stated, you'd have 2,500 state prosecutors filing federal charges against the opposition in the federal government without the federal government or DOJ involved.
An insurrection that was incited in plain sight.
You're really not answering my question. It's not helpful if you don't do that. Suppose we have two different records, two different bodies of evidence, two different rulings on questions of admissibility, two different standards of proof, two different sets of fact findings by two different judges, or maybe multiple judges in multiple states. Then what do we do?
Well, first, this court would set the legal standard, and then it would decide which view of the record was correct. I think under that, if this court had two cases,
which view of what record? Which record?
If this court had two cases before it, and both of the records were sufficient insofar as both sides had the opportunity to present their case and the essential facts in the record that everyone agreed was sufficient for decision, then this court would have to look at the evidence presented and decide which which holding was correct and then decide that issue for the country. And certainly here, when there is a complete record, lower courts then will be applying that decision, and I think it's unlikely that any court would say we're going to reach a different decision than the U.S. Supreme Court did, particularly if the court relies on the facts, the indisputable facts of what President Trump said.
So not only was it disputable, up for debate, but this was overturned. So this is just an example of Samuel Alito confronting the Colorado legal view. The Colorado State Supreme Court verdict was overturned. Okay, this is an example of the federal government looking at a state Supreme Court and overturning the state Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, again, did not look at the case today. And tomorrow he's sentenced. Big deal. It actually benefits Trump. He's the Obi-Wan Kenobi of politics. Everything that they do makes him stronger. This will expedite. Tomorrow's sentencing will expedite the Supreme Court looking at this. The Supreme Court looking at this and saying, okay, we issued an immunity ruling, but we also have a system of federalism. So under our system of federalism, a state cannot level a federal charge, just like John Yoo stated, and like Alina Habba is going to state right now, they won an immunity victory. Hope Hicks's testimony, possibly Michael Cohen's numerous examples of perjury, likely perjury, won't stand. So this is Alina Habba talking about the immunity victory.
Joining us now, incoming counselor to President-elect Trump, Alina Habba. Alina, we love talking to you. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. First, do you have any more details on the alleged misconduct by the juror in this case?
I do, as part of, obviously I'm part of the team, but those are not ones that I am willing to share at this point. What I can tell you is it's definitely egregious, despite the redactions, and without getting into detail, it is not a questionable thing. There was misconduct by the jurors, and it would have anything thrown out. Now, one thing we are learning, as you've delicately said, but I will say more directly, Judge Merchan's description of what happened and what falls under the Supreme Court's decision is so flawed and egregious and so ridiculous. He is completely disregarding the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court that said that there is presidential immunity for official acts. And now he is trying to carve out in any way he can to preserve face and say that this trial was not a complete hoax, was not a complete disaster, an evidentiary disaster. And now we know there were issues with the jury being tainted. So, this is where we are. And this is where we've been for 3.5 years. And frankly, why I think we won.
Alina, so we've got allegations of a juror's misconduct in the case. Can you please tell us how this case is ripe for appeal? Legal experts have told us there are a lot of constitutional violations. The jury wrongly heard evidence that
there are numerous constitutional violations. I'm not even getting to, the court just said, pick a crime, any crime. Pick a crime, any crime. And I'm not even getting to that. I'm not even getting to the fact that these are misdemeanors where the statute of limitations expired. I'm not even getting to the fact that it wasn't even Trump's money. It was Michael Cohen's money. He started a corporation. Okay, he started a corporation and used his own money. There are numerous constitutional issues. A state cannot level a federal charge without the federal government involved. The verdict did not cite any federal statute, and a state doesn't have the right to level a federal statute without the Department of Justice involved. That's right there. That's clear, and the Supreme Court will overturn that, just like John Yoo said. It's 100% certainty, but they haven't looked at it. That's why if you're watching this live stream, hit subscribe to this channel right now. This was not a Supreme Court decision on the constitutionality or whether or not the guilty verdict was constitutional. It was not a decision that addressed that. This was simply allowing the state to continue with the greatest farce and theatrical performance in modern political history, one of the greatest, Democrats and Hollywood are, united forever because they're both basically actors and it's all performance art. Well, Trump was a Kremlin operative. It's like the Kremlin, if the Kremlin's not really frightened of Biden or Democrats. Look what they've done, unfortunately, the past, 4 years since Democrats have been in office. But anyway, the point is, there's numerous constitutional issues. When the court does get the actual guilty verdict and decides whether it's constitutional, it's not up for debate whether they'll overturn it, because then you'll have complete and utter chaos. You'll have state prosecutors indicting and prosecuting, for example, Democratic lawmakers in the Senate without the Department of Justice involved. That can't happen.
The jury wrongly heard evidence that was protected by presidential immunity the Supreme Court upheld, like President Trump's conversations with Hope Hicks. The judge delayed sentencing indefinitely. That's clearly a due process right to a speedy trial violation. And now juror misconduct. It sounds like that juror was tainted. There could have been bias here.
Yeah, let's add some to that. Statute of limitations, which before they brought this, we knew was passed. This case was passed up by Cy Vance. It was passed up prior by Bragg, and then it was brought again. How about we also discuss that the White House was coordinating and sent their own guy into work for the New York DA from the DOJ? How about that? How about selective prosecution, election interference, tying this man up in a hoax case during an election cycle when he should have been campaigning? How about all of the things you said? But this is where we have problems. The judge should have recused. We've said it time and time again. We have one thing standing right now before all the appeals we will take on this ridiculous decision today, and that is the motion to dismiss that this judge gave us leave to file. I don't have much hope in Judge Merchan, but we do have pending motions. Go ahead.
Sorry, Alina. So, Senator.
By the way, thank you for the kind words, everybody. On the YouTube app on your phone, make sure you've enabled notifications. So many have told me, hey, I'm not getting your notifications, HA, how come? And so, yeah, just make sure that on the YouTube app, there's the enable notification. It's in the settings, and hit subscribe if you're new, but also when you see that perhaps there's a live stream in a couple of hours or 4 hours, just hit notification on the live stream, then you'll definitely get notified. But thank you for letting me know, and thank you for watching. I appreciate all the kind words, everybody.
Chuck Grassley, has said, this is really scary that all Americans, right or left, he's saying, take the politics out of it. When you see the lawfare abuses, it could happen to you. It could happen to viewers. That's why millennial voters, we heard, were so scared about what the Justice Department and what cases like DA Bragg brought. They feel it could happen to them personally. This was a books and records misdemeanor, like a parking ticket, but it got ramped up into 34 felonies. That's terrifying for the American judicial system. Final word.
Yes. Yes, and he was not there. He was in the White House as president. These are acts that were done by an accounting team at the Trump Organization. And there is so many uncanny things happening here. And the American people are afraid, and they should be afraid, but not anymore. Because I can assure you that when we go in and when this administration gets to work, it will be top of mind to fix this lawfare and prosecution against a political opponent or any American. It should not happen.
Okay, Alina Habba, thank you.
Attorney Alvin Bragg.
So you look at every single prosecution, ladies and gentlemen, even this guilty verdict or sentencing, okay, it's not going in Georgia, the two cases in Washington, D.C., or the Georgia, the Florida case, the case in D.C., all dismissed or all, will be completely dissolved. And when the Supreme, like when President Trump becomes president, the special counsel will be dissolved. So the classified data case, which, by the way, is nothing compared to what took place with Clinton and also Biden. With Biden, he was actually guilty of crimes, but the special counsel said, well, you know what, he wasn't competent enough to stand trial. So, okay, yet he's the most powerful person on the planet. He won. He's the most popular candidate of all time, and Democrats within less than 4 years kicked him out for the vice president who polled lower than the president. We're supposed to believe that Trump knew that he lost fair and square. It's like nobody believes any of this stuff. That's why he won the popular vote. But let's continue.
Brief asking the judge in Bragg's case.
By the way, again, the New York case was not heard by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court simply looked at whether to stop sentencing. That's it. They did not look at the merits. They did not look at the constitutionality. They did not look at the obvious unconstitutional verdict where a state levels a federal statute without even mentioning the federal statute and without even utilizing the Department of Justice. Just unilaterally. That's never happened. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe that's ever happened in the history of the country. Correct me if I'm wrong. Has a state ever convicted anyone of a federal statute without the federal government involved? If there's a highly educated, morally superior, liberal Democrat, legal scholar, lawyer, attorney, anyone, has a state, where's the precedent? Where's the legal precedent? Has a state ever convicted anyone of a federal crime without the Department of Justice, without the federal government involved? Because the federal government apparently wasn't involved. We know this because Democrats were so proud that they didn't have that Biden's White House wasn't involved. It's like, well, but the top DOJ official then took a pay cut and then worked with the state prosecutors anyway. It's so obviously partisan. But this was not a victory. This was actually, in a roundabout way, a victory for Trump. The Supreme Court's going to look at this. When they look at it, it will be overturned 100%.
Case against incoming President Trump not to drop the case. Trump's attorneys, as you know, just last week, exactly 1 week ago today, were
Rob, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you. To my super chat, thank you. Thank you, Rob.
arguing that Trump has presidential immunity and other constitutional protections. Bragg's team wants Trump to be sentenced after a jury found him guilty of falsifying business records. Here's a quote. The extreme remedy of dismissing the indictment and vacating the jury verdict is not warranted in light of multiple alternative accommodations that would fully address the concerns raised by presidential immunity. One legal correspondent put it this way.
It's not a surprise that the Manhattan DA's office is refusing to dismiss the case. But what is a surprise in these filings today is that in over 80 pages, they are telling Judge Merchan, look, the preservation of our verdict is important. And it shows you just how far they've gone in an attempt to preserve this jury verdict, which they think is fundamental to the constitutional value of the jury process.
In focus now, Alina Habba, incoming White House counselor to
Then why didn't the Department of Justice level a statute against Trump? Well, this is, of course, unconstitutional.
President-elect Trump and his former attorney. Alina, is this good news for the former president that this push is coming on? I mean, how do you see it?
I think that Alvin Bragg is so self-interested and his team that he is failing the American people. And what America needs right now is unity. This case should have been dismissed. It never should have been brought in the first place. It was past statute of limitations. Nothing ever happened. The president did nothing wrong. And the evidence that was presented was clearly outside of the perimeters of anything that should have been considered, as he was president of the United States, not even at the Trump Organization during the time period they were questioning. Immunity decisions have come down, have made clear.
So it's not just the system of federalism where a state can't level a federal statute, but it's the immunity, big, huge immunity ruling. I mean, the Supreme Court already, by the way, overturned a state Supreme Court decision in Colorado. The precedent is the immunity victory and the Colorado decision being overturned. That's also precedent here, because the rebuttal will be, oh, a state has never been overturned by the Supreme Court, or maybe it's rare as never. The Supreme Court overturned unanimously the Colorado State Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned the Colorado State Supreme Court unanimously, 9-0. Even the liberal justices overturned. So then Trump had a huge immunity victory, which gutted the evidence in the case. But of course, they're like, well, there's no problem. There's no immunity issue here. It's like, once it gets to the Supreme Court, they look at it. They did not look at the case. It will be 100%, like John Yoo, like I'm stating, like others have stated, overturned.
Clear that he has immunity, but DA Bragg, unlike Jack Smith, just won't quit. Meanwhile, they haven't extradited Penny, as you said, excuse me, not Penny, but they haven't extradited the gentleman from Altoona who has just shot and killed somebody on the streets of New York yet. You know, this is the hypocrisy that has destroyed America and is the reason 77 million people voted for President Trump to be president again.
Yeah, you know, and the way that I put it like that is because Bragg just came off a pretty bruising loss with Daniel Penny. I mean, in that case, again, that never should have been brought. You had someone who was a Marine vet on the subway, a hero to the people inside that car down beneath, and Penny rescued them and put down a man who was threatening them inside that car. I mean, I would think watching Bragg get this thirsty might be good news, because he's going to make mistakes.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And more importantly, I mean, where is your dignity? And this goes for Fannie as well.
Good question.
Where is your dignity? How do you want to be remembered in history? And that's my question I would pose to them, because we will not allow this to continue. I most certainly will not. It is unacceptable. It is hurting the American people and the constituents in the state of New York that have elected him and had him come in. And Alvin Bragg has literally ignored the needs of New Yorkers. He is soft on crime for people that are actually committing crime, and he is then persecuting and prosecuting people like Penny and Donald Trump, who are here to help America and to help real Americans. It's a disgrace. He should be ashamed of himself, and 80-something pages of taxpayer dollars wasted on that motion.
Wow.
When all he should have done was step down and said, we're going to dismiss this case. It never should have happened in the first place.
Yeah, surprised he could get that work done, because he was too busy losing that also very high-profile and important case that never should have been brought against Daniel Penny. It's interesting that you also put those two people together. Fulton County, Georgia District Attorney Fani Willis, in the same sentence as Alvin Bragg. I can see how you get there. They're both so much in a drought for any sort of way to go after Trump. Well, this is the latest. Willis has refused a judge's order now to hand over any communications that were with special counsel Jack Smith and the House January 6th committee. Willis is prosecuting President-elect Trump's 2020 election interference case in Georgia. Now, she denies ever talking to Jack Smith about the case and says there are no records to hand over. Willis also claimed there are legal exemptions to justify withholding communications with the January 6th committee. A new piece argues this. Willis's refusal to hand over records suggests she is willing to clash with her critics on yet another front, even as she faces the possibility of disqualification from her own case. Jonathan Turley had something to say about this, about Trump's team asking a Georgia appeals court to throw out the case. Let's watch that.
This entire case is leaking like a sieve, and it always has, because it was based on, in my view, a ridiculous RICO theory to get to the president. On top of that, you have Willis.
Every one of the cases against Trump were mangled, butchered, contorted legal theories, Byzantine attempts, legal theories, attempts at connecting, leaps of logic with legal statutes that have nothing to do with what Trump did. So they're like, the way Democrats, the morally superior, highly educated liberal Democrats, the way they did Trump was they said he performed a speech, and therefore, from his speech, he tried to rebel and overthrow the government. Then he knew he was He lost fair and square to a person who couldn't even communicate, who probably couldn't even win mayor in a small town in Europe. And he spread lies to state officials. He spoke to other Republicans who agreed with his egregious, nefarious plan to overturn the will of the people. Well, are you then going to level racketeering charges at the Democratic Party? What happened to the will of the people? Biden won his primary. He was then completely ousted and removed, kicked to the curb, and for his vice president. Wait, Democrats lied to their own constituents and to the country? Didn't Biden win the primary? Oh, that's right. They just do whatever they want at all times. They make absurd leaps of logic, and then when it suits them, they'll just trample upon democracy. They don't care. They did that to Bernie Sanders. It was a million times worse what they did to Biden, but they're too stupid to realize what they did, so they don't care. It's just unbelievable. Then they said, well, Trump committed a felony. How do we know? Because of these expired misdemeanors where it's not even an FEC violation. We haven't even gotten to that. The former FEC chairman, Hans-A von Spakovsky, Bradley Smith, and Trey Traynor have all stated it's not, these aren't FEC crimes, what Trump did. He could have paid Stormy with dollar bills. It wouldn't have been an FEC crime. The Federal Election Commission dropped the case. Again, the FEC dropped the case. Debbie, thank you. Debbie, thank you so very, very, very much. Thank you, Debbie. To my super chat, thank you. Let's continue.
His own conduct and whether she should be removed from the case. So it's a big debate as to what will bring this case down. I just can't see, even if she was able to secure a conviction, that she would be able to sustain it on appeal.
Well, Alina, the way I read this is she's kind of stuck in a sticky wicket, because if she turns over records, then that will cause people to think that there was some sort of conspiracy between her and Jack Smith against Donald Trump.
Say it ain't so. You can't imagine that would be happening, could you? Listen, the truth is this, we know there was. We've seen White House records that show that a lot of these DAs and AGs were visiting the White House and coordinating with not only outside sources like Jack Smith, but also the White House administration. Unacceptable. That's political motivation. That's selective prosecution. Those are things that are unconstitutional. We do not do them in this country. My message is the same for Fannie. Do the right thing. You've embarrassed yourself enough. This case was a joke. It's a hoax. And we really need the American people to have what little faith they have restored in our justice system. And that starts with all of these hoaxes being dropped and them saying we respect the rule of law. Mm-hmm. We understand the presidency. We understand that maybe we were a little sideways, but now we're going to do the right thing for America, not for President Trump.
Alina Habba, congratulations on the incoming position. Great to have you on the program.
So, ladies and gentlemen, they did not look at the case. They simply allowed sentencing. This is not a victory for the morally superior, highly educated liberal Democrats who lost the popular vote, every battleground state, the Senate, the House, the presidency, and they don't have the Supreme Court. Okay, the Supreme Court actually, if you want to know, if you want to know my viewpoint, I mean, they actually, I can see I would have loved for them to just block the sentencing based on immunity and based on the fact that a state cannot level a federal charge. But that's fine. It's fine what they did. I don't want to say it's the right decision, but it's logical, it's rational, it's reasonable. I mean, it's what they're meant to do in a way. They're not going to get involved in a case if it didn't come to them, if they didn't accept an actual Supreme Court case that looks at whether or not it's constitutional. They're just like, okay, he was convicted in a state. We'll allow sentencing. He's going to be sworn in 10 days or so, 11 days. And once they get the case, then you will have what John Yoo says.
And basically decided to prosecute his own interpretation of federal law. That's not permissible under our separation of powers and federalism, and the Supreme Court will reverse if, as you say, Mark, they get a chance to hear this case.
They have not heard the case yet. They simply will allow. They simply are allowing sentencing, and Trump is as much a convicted felon as Biden is a victorious primary candidate. Okay, so does anyone say, yeah, Joe Biden won his primary in a landslide, which he did? Go look at the map, by the way. It's hilarious. It's just all blue. Okay, Supreme Court utilizes, they throw out convictions all the time. All the time. This was not, like I said, absolutely not, this was not an example of the Supreme Court looking at anything pertaining to the guilty verdict. It was simply allowing the state to sentence Trump, and it's like, okay, media, 70% of Americans don't trust media. Okay? Around the same number of Americans don't trust, this is according to Gallup, don't trust government. All right. So, and we know why now. Because these are all lies by omission. Trump's a convicted felon, and it'll be overturned on appeal when the Supreme Court looks at the actual constitutionality, not the sentencing. But he's not a convicted felon in the sense that he actually committed this heinous crime. He's not a convicted felon in the sense that, you know, where you would experience the same types of emotions when you hear that the semantics of a convicted felon. He's only a convicted felon in the minds of people who despise him, who think that he also said both sides and he was a Kremlin operative who didn't pay his taxes and who did this and that. None of it's true. None of what you heard about Trump from liberal Democrats is true. Either it's a complete lie or a lie by omission. Anyway, hit subscribe to this channel, ladies and gentlemen. That's why he won the popular vote. Hit subscribe. Thank you so very much. We will be back tomorrow. I will do a live stream tomorrow right after he's sentenced. And again, the sentencing only expedites the Supreme Court looking at this case. So it's an actual victory for Trump in a roundabout way. Hit subscribe. God bless you all. Thank you for the kind words, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow. And what can I tell you? God bless America. Left, right, Democrats, Republicans. God bless you. At the end of the day, thank you, Democratic Party. You're just helping Trump become even more popular in your maniacal attempt at ripping apart the Constitution, which, by the way, the Supreme Court will seem back together when they overturn a blatantly unconstitutional guilty verdict.